January 30th, 1944. 7:47 a.m. over Rabaul, Papua New Guinea. A single Corsair rolls inverted at 12,000 feet and dives straight into 21 enemy fighters. No wingman, no backup, no hesitation. The pilot squeezes the trigger. 6.50 caliber Brownings erupt at once. The lead Zero explodes in a fireball, visible from the harbor below. Debris scatters across 5,000 feet of sky. And somewhere in the chaos, a 23-year-old Marine from Indiana is already lining up his next shot. His name was Robert Murray Hansen, son of Methodist missionaries, former wrestling champion, quiet, methodical, deadly. In the 16 days before this morning, he had shot down 21 confirmed enemy aircraft. In a single engagement on January 14th, he destroyed 5 Zeros in 12 minutes and landed with 14 bullet holes in his plane and 3 gallons of fuel remaining. His fellow pilots called him Butcher Bob, not out of cruelty, out of awe. And on January 30th, 1944, with 1 week left before his scheduled transport home, he climbed into Bureau number 56039 and pointed it at the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. What happened next would be recorded in the Medal of Honor citation as a lone and gallant battle striking with devastating fury. What happened next would send shockwaves across the entire Pacific War. And what happened next began with a single engine firing to life in the dark on a coral runway while 18 slow torpedo bombers rolled into position ahead of him. This is the story of the most extraordinary single aircraft engagement in Marine Corps aviation history. To understand what Robert Hansen did on January 30th, you have to understand what Rabaul meant in early 1944. Simpson Harbor was not just a Japanese base. It was a fortress, a strategic anchor so heavily fortified that Allied commanders had debated for months whether it could ever be taken by direct assault. Radar installations crowned every surrounding hill. Anti-aircraft gun batteries ringed the harbor in overlapping fields of fire. Japanese intelligence counted 70 fighters permanently stationed there, with reinforcements available within minutes of any alert. The harbor itself sheltered capital ships, supply vessels and troop transports that fed the entire Japanese defensive network across the Southwest Pacific. Since November 1943, Allied bombers had been hitting Rabaul repeatedly, trying to neutralize it without the catastrophic cost of a ground invasion. The results were devastating on both sides. 43 Marine pilots had been lost over Rabaul in just 2 months, not missing in action. Lost. Gone. Every approach route was mapped, timed, and pre-registered by Japanese anti-aircraft crews who had been tracking American formations for weeks. The enemy knew exactly where the bombers would come from. They knew the altitude, they knew the speeds, and they had 70 fighters ready to climb and intercept at a moment's notice. The Marines kept going back anyway, because Simpson Harbor had to be destroyed, and because no one had found a better option. On the morning of January 30th, the mission plan called for 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers to strike the harbor at low altitude, while 8 F4U Corsairs provided high-cover escort. 18 slow-heavy, relatively vulnerable aircraft against one of the most defended targets in the world, protected by 8 fighters. The math was brutal from the start. The Avengers were essential. Lose the bombers, and the mission failed completely. Lose too many bombers, and the squadron might not recover. The Corsairs existed for one purpose that morning: keep the Japanese fighters off the Avengers long enough for the strike to complete. Robert Hansen had already flown 6 consecutive missions over Rabaul. He understood the tactical reality better than almost anyone alive. He had been separated from his formation over Simpson Harbor on January 14th, and rather than retreat, had dived alone into a climbing Japanese formation and destroyed 5 aircraft in under 15 minutes. He had done it again on January 24th, cut off once more, fighting alone, shooting down 4 more Zeros in a battle that his squadron mates later described as something they could barely believe watching from a distance. He knew what the Japanese fighters would do when they saw the Avengers. He knew the climb profiles, the preferred attack angles, the tendency to break formation when surprised from above and behind. He had studied them the way a wrestler studies an opponent before a match. Systematically, patiently, looking for the exact moment to commit. Major Robert Owens had tried twice to ground him. The logic was straightforward. Hansen was scheduled to ship home on February 10th. His tour was complete. His kill count was extraordinary. Continuing to fly combat over Rabaul with 7 days left before departure was not a calculated risk. It was a statistic waiting to happen. Owens told him this plainly. Hansen acknowledged the concern, thanked his commanding officer, and showed up at the briefing tent at 0600 on January 30th. At 6:48 a.m., Hansen taxied Bureau number 56039 into takeoff position. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp caught on the third blade and erupted into the deep rolling thunder that only a Corsair produced. 2,000 horsepower. 417 miles per hour at full throttle. The most powerful piston engine fighter in the Marine Corps inventory. Hansen pushed the throttle forward. The runway disappeared beneath him, and the Pacific opened under his wings in the gray light before sunrise. By 7:30, the formation crossed the northern coast of Bougainville. Simpson Harbor was 90 miles ahead. Hansen checked his weapons, 6 .50 caliber Brownings, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. Enough firepower to tear aluminum apart and ignite fuel tanks, or enough to vanish in seconds if he was wasteful. He was never wasteful. Over the radio, the bomber leader called the approach vector calm and precise. The Corsair pilots acknowledged. Then a voice cut through the static. Enemy fighters climbing out of Rabaul, 21 of them. 17 Mitsubishi A6M0s and 4 Nakajima Ki 44 Tojos rising through 9,000 feet and accelerating hard toward the formation. For 2 years, the Zero had ruled the Pacific sky. Extraordinary climb rate. Brutal 20mm cannons. A turning radius so tight that American pilots who tried to dogfight them at low speed rarely lived long enough to try it twice. The Corsair had its own advantages. 86 miles per hour, faster in level flight, heavier armor, devastating firepower in the forward 6 Brownings. But every Marine pilot who survived long enough to become experienced understood one fundamental rule. Never turn with a Zero. Dive fire, climb away. Maintain energy. Never get slow. The pilot who got slow over Rabaul did not come home. Hansen had broken that rule 16 times in 17 days. Doctrine on the morning of January 30th was clear. Stay in formation. Protect the bombers. Maintain position above the Avengers, and let the Japanese fighters come to you. Engage only what threatens the strike force directly. The other 7 Corsairs held tight above the Avengers. High cover. Formation intact. Exactly as ordered. Hansen rolled inverted and dived straight at the climbing Japanese formation. The Corsair screamed downward, the airspeed needle surging past 400 miles per hour as he locked onto the lead Zero. Standard doctrine when breaking a formation, kill the leader first. Destroy the command element, and the coordinated attack collapses into individuals reacting without direction. At 800 yards, the Japanese pilot finally saw him coming. The formation began to bank, trying to present a more difficult angle. Too late. Hansen had altitude. He had speed. The Zero swelled in his gun sight at 600 yards, then 500, then 400, turning hard left, trying to slip away from the line of fire. At 300 yards, Hansen squeezed the trigger. All 6 Brownings fired simultaneously. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, 6 streams of .50 caliber fire intersecting at a single lethal point. Tracers stitched across the Zero's fuselage. The engine cowling tore apart. Black smoke erupted from the forward section. The fighter rolled over and fell into a spin, trailing fire all the way down. 1 down. 20 to go. Hansen pulled out at 5,000 feet his speed, carrying him completely through the stunned Japanese formation, before the surviving pilots could react. He reversed and began to climb. Behind him, the sky fractured. 15 fighters broke off to pursue the lone Corsair. 6 continued toward the Avengers, which meant the 18 torpedo bombers below now faced 6 fighters instead of 21. The mission had breathing room. The strike force could complete its attack. And Robert Hansen, completely alone, had 15 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced fighter pilots clawing after him at once. The nearest Zero was 400 yards back and closing fast. In level flight, the Corsair was faster, but Hansen was climbing and Zeros climbed better at low speed. The gap shrank. 350. 300. At 280 yards, the Zero opened fire. Tracers sliced past his canopy. One round punched through the vertical stabilizer. Another ripped into the wing root. Not critical yet. Hansen shoved the throttle to its stop. The Pratt & Whitney howled. He snap-rolled right. The Zero could not match his roll rate, overshot the firing solution, and for a fraction of a second the geometry shifted in Hansen's favor. He dove again, repositioned, climbed back to altitude, and at 7,000 feet inverted above the scattered Japanese formation. He looked down at 14 fighters spread across 5,000 feet of sky, searching for a target they had momentarily lost. They did not know where he was. He knew exactly where each of them was. He had the altitude. He had the speed. And he had 13 more aircraft to kill before his ammunition ran out. What happened next above Simpson Harbor on January 30th, 1944, was not just aerial combat. It was one man systematically dismantling 21 fighters, using nothing but a Corsair 6 machine guns, and a tactical intelligence that his enemies could not match and his own commanders could barely believe. The full battle was only just beginning, and before it ended, Robert Hansen would push his confirmed kill total to 25, tie the record for the highest-scoring active Marine pilot in the Pacific, and land a dying aircraft with 47 bullet holes on a runway at Piva North while fire crews scrambled to meet him. But first, he had to survive the next 40 minutes. 15 Japanese fighters were chasing one Corsair. The bombers were safe. The mission objective had been achieved. Any rational pilot would have turned southeast and run for Bougainville. Robert Hansen had already shot down one Zero, drawn 15 pursuers, away from 18 vulnerable Avengers, and done exactly what a fighter escort was supposed to do. He owed nobody anything more. He had 7 days left before his transport ship home. He did not turn southeast. At 7,000 feet inverted above the scattered formation, he looked down at 14 Japanese fighters spread across the sky below him, and he began calculating. Not escaping. Calculating. Because Hansen understood something that the pilots pursuing him had not yet grasped. They were no longer a formation. They were individuals. And individuals, no matter how skilled, lose to a man who still controls his geometry. The nearest Zero was 350 yards back and still climbing when Hansen rolled and dove again. He had the altitude. He had the initiative. He picked the Zero farthest to the left of the group, the one whose pilot was still scanning forward and had not yet located the Corsair, dropping behind him from high 6 o'clock. At 300 yards, Hansen fired. The 6 Brownings fired 80 rounds per second, 6 streams of fire converging at a single point smaller than a bathtub. The Zero's right wing folded upward. The fuselage snapped. No parachute appeared. 2 down. Now every remaining pilot in the formation knew exactly where he was. Tracers converged from 3 directions simultaneously. Hansen hauled left, the G-forces crushing him into the seat at 5 then 6 Gs, the edges of his vision fading gray at the periphery. 3 Zeros locked into pursuit. He leveled and accelerated, 410 miles per hour the distance opening. But 4 more were climbing ahead of him, positioning to cut off his escape vector. Classic pincer. 3 behind 4, ahead 7 fighters converging on one Corsair with nowhere clean to go. He pitched vertical. The altimeter unwound upward, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 feet. The 4 climbing fighters ahead were still rising, closing to 450 yards, then 400. Both sides opened fire at once. Tracers filled the sky between them. Hansen's burst struck the lead Zero square in the engine. It rolled away trailing smoke. 3 down. Return fire hammered the Corsair. A round punched through the instrument panel. Glass exploded into the cockpit. Another tore a 2-foot hole in the right control surface. A third slammed into the armor plate behind his seat. The plate held. Hansen rolled inverted and dove south, leveling out at 390 miles per hour, putting distance between himself and the fractured pursuit. Below, the remaining Japanese fighters were regrouping. He circled at 12,000 feet and watched them, and what he saw was both tactically perfect and tactically terrifying. 15 fighters pulling into a rotating defensive circle at 8,000 feet, each aircraft 200 yards behind the one ahead, counterclockwise continuous. The Lufberry Circle. The Imperial Navy's answer to exactly this kind of attack. Commit to kill one aircraft in the ring and the next in line has a clean shot at you. The math was merciless. The geometry appeared airtight. Appeared. Hansen studied it for 40 seconds. He checked his ammunition. Roughly 800 rounds expended. 1,600 remaining. He checked the engine temperature. Normal. He checked his fuel. 90 gallons. He looked at the circle rotating below him, and he did not see a trap. He saw a pattern. And patterns have timing. Patterns have gaps. Patterns can be entered from an angle that the pattern was never designed to defend. He rolled and dove from 12,000 feet building speed, past 420 miles per hour. The critical decision was the angle of entry. Every American pilot who had ever tried to attack a Lufberry circle had done it by cutting straight across, diving perpendicular to the ring's rotation, which presented maximum closure speed against maximum defensive coverage. Hansen did not cut across the circle. He entered on a tangent, aligning his dive with the direction of rotation flowing with the ring instead of colliding against it. The relative closure rate dropped sharply. For a brief window, the geometry inverted. The Zero behind his target could not fire without risking the aircraft ahead of it. The Zero ahead of his target was pointing away. At 600 yards, the nearest Japanese pilot spotted him. The circle began to break. Too late. Hansen opened fire. The cockpit of the nearest Zero erupted. The fighter flipped inverted and fell away. 4 down. He pulled out inside the circle itself, and instead of climbing immediately leveled off and accelerated along the same rotational path. For 3 seconds, the remaining Zeros were pointed in every wrong direction. He selected the aircraft 200 yards ahead and fired a tight 2-second burst. The left wing ripped free. The aircraft snap-rolled into a flat spin. 5 down. The circle shattered. Mutual support dissolved into a furball, fighters breaking in every direction without coordination, every pilot reacting individually rather than acting as a unit. 2 Zeros locked onto Hansen's tail at 400 yards. He rolled inverted, pulled through, rolled upright, a high-speed split S that burned altitude but broke the firing solution cleanly. Another Zero crossed ahead unaware. He fired from 500 yards. 3 rounds struck the tail section. The vertical stabilizer tore away. The fighter yawed violently and dove toward the ocean. 6 down. 5 more Japanese fighters immediately reformed and tightened their pursuit with renewed discipline. The lead Zero at 300 yards opened fire. Tracers walked up Hansen's left side. 1 round hit the canopy rail. Another punched through the fuselage behind the cockpit. A third struck the landing gear door. The Corsair shuddered. Hydraulic fluid streamed back along the fuselage in a thin red mist. He pushed the throttle to maximum continuous power. Not war emergency yet. The engine temperature was climbing. The cooling system had taken damage. Altitude read 7,000 feet and dropping. The Zeros were forcing him down toward 4,000 feet, their optimal fighting altitude, where their superior maneuverability would dominate against a slower, heavier aircraft. The lead Zero fired again. Hansen snapped hard right 7 Gs, his vision tunneling gray at the edges. The burst missed. Another Zero slid into firing position at 280 yards. He pulled vertical for the 4th time in this engagement. Airspeed bled away, 300, 280, 260. At the apex, he rolled inverted, kicked through a hammerhead, and dropped nose first straight down at the 5 climbing fighters below him. Head on, closure rate nearly 700 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots scattered 2 left, 2 right, 1 holding course and trusting his aircraft's maneuverability. Hansen fired at 400 yards, calculating deflection angle and gravity drop in the fraction of a second available. 20 rounds struck the Zero's engine. The cowling exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and plunged away, 7 down. The pass cost him altitude and speed. He leveled at 5,000 feet at barely 260 miles per hour, dangerously slow, dangerously low. The remaining fighters reformed instantly, 6 now in disciplined pursuit, 2 leading and 4 trailing in bracket formation. The temperature gauge moved into the red. Coolant was streaming behind the cowling in a visible pink mist. The engine was overheating. The right aileron had taken additional damage, and rolling right was becoming sluggish, delayed half its former response speed. He dove once more toward the ocean, leveling at 2,000 feet over dark blue water. Maximum speed had fallen from 417 to 390 miles per hour. The Zeros were faster now. At 300 yards, the lead fighter fired a long burst. Hansen rolled left, the only direction the damaged aileron answered cleanly. 2 Zeros overshot and flashed across his nose. He fired a 1-second burst, 50 rounds. The nearest Zero's tail section shredded. The aircraft snapped into a flat spin. 8 down. Ammunition 590 rounds remaining. The 4 remaining fighters reformed into a bracket, 2 to his left, 2 to his right, closing the trap from both sides simultaneously. If he turned left, the pair on his right would fire. If he turned right, the pair on his left would fire. He pulled vertical 1 final time. At the apex, inverted at 4,000 feet, he made the decision that no part of him wanted to make. He did not roll back into the fight. He dove southeast. Away from Rabaul. Away from the remaining 4 fighters. Away from the engagement that had lasted 40 minutes and covered 80 square miles of Pacific sky. The aircraft was too damaged. The engine was failing. The ammunition was nearly exhausted. The 4 Zeros followed at first 400 yards back, then 450, then 500. At 600 yards, they broke off and turned home. Chasing a wounded Corsair 80 miles over open ocean made no tactical sense when their own fuel was limited, and their base lay behind them. Hansen held southeast at 340 miles per hour. Altitude 3,000 feet. Distance to Bougainville 87 miles. 17 minutes if the engine survived. The temperature gauge was pinned in the red. Oil pressure dropped from 65 to 58 pounds per square inch. Normal operating pressure was 85. At 50, bearing seizure became likely. He eased the throttle back slightly. Temperature fell 2 degrees. Oil pressure steadied at 58. Airspeed dropped to 310. Flight time stretched to 19 minutes. 10 miles from Bougainville, oil pressure slipped again. 56. 54. The engine began to knock. Deep, rhythmic, the sound of bearings running dry. Piva North Airfield appeared through the windscreen, a thin coral strip beyond green jungle and white beach. He transmitted a brief emergency call. Aircraft damaged, engine failing, requesting priority landing. The tower acknowledged. Fire trucks rolled. Oil pressure hit 42. The engine seized. The propeller froze. Silence replaced the thunder of 2,000 horsepower. The Corsair became a glider at 900 feet with 1 mile to the runway. Descent rate 800 feet per minute. He adjusted the glide precisely. At 500 feet, he was aligned with the center line. At 100 feet, he flared. The main gear touched down 140 feet past the threshold. The tail settled. The aircraft rolled 800 feet and stopped. Ground crews counted 47 bullet holes. The right aileron hung by 2 cables. The engine cowling was blackened and cracked. The fuselage was coated in oil. The intelligence officer arrived with a clipboard and asked how many enemy aircraft Hansen had destroyed. Hansen reported 9. Gun camera footage and witness statements confirmed 4 kills officially. 4 confirmed victories pushed his total to 25, tied for the highest score among active Marine Corps pilots in the entire Pacific theater, one behind Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. War correspondents were at the airstrip that evening. By the next morning, Robert Hansen's name appeared in newspapers across the United States. Major Owens handed him a certificate naming him the top-scoring Corsair pilot in theater, then pulled him aside and said simply, "9 days, Hansen." February 10th. No more combat. Hansen thanked him and walked back to his tent. He had 7 days left. 7 days between the most celebrated Marine fighter pilot in the Pacific and a transport ship home. 7 days. And somewhere on a desk in the operations tent, a mission order was already being typed for February 3rd. A strike on Taberra Airfield, near Rabaul. One pilot short, due to food poisoning, a slot that nobody had yet filled. Nobody except the man walking alone across the coral toward his tent, already thinking about the morning. Robert Hansen landed a dying Corsair with 47 bullet holes, 9 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement, and a confirmed kill total of 25. He was tied for the highest-scoring active Marine pilot in the Pacific. He had 7 days before his transport home. Major Owens had given him a direct order. No more combat. And Hansen had walked back to his tent without argument, which should have been reassuring. It was not, because the men who knew him best understood that Robert Hansen never argued. He simply decided. And the decision he was already making in the silence of that walk across the coral would cost him everything. By the evening of January 30th, 1944, Japanese intelligence officers at Rabaul were staring at a problem they could not easily explain. In a single morning engagement, one American fighter had entered a formation of 21 aircraft, destroyed a confirmed minimum of 4, disrupted a coordinated attack on an Allied strike force, and survived. Not survived by running, survived by fighting. The debriefs from returning Japanese pilots described a Corsair that had entered their defensive Loufberry circle from a tangent angle, a maneuver that should have been suicidal, and instead had collapsed the circle completely in under 30 seconds. The reports landed on the desk of the Rabaul Air Group commander and stayed there, because there was no clean tactical answer to what they described. The numbers coming out of Rabaul in January 1944 were alarming to Japanese planners in ways that individual engagements alone could not explain. Since November 1943, Allied fighter pilots escorting bomber formations had begun engaging Japanese defensive formations with increasing aggression rather than maintaining protective formation discipline around their bombers. The results were statistically significant. Japanese interception success rates against Allied bombing raids on Simpson Harbor dropped from 61% in November to 38% in January. Bomber loss rates per sortie fell from 7% to just under 3% across the same period. The Japanese air group at Rabaul had lost an estimated 40 aircraft in January alone, against a target that their commanders had considered one of the most defensively impregnable positions in the Southwest Pacific. They convened an emergency tactical review on February 1st. The conclusion was direct. American pilots had found a way to use the Corsair's superior speed and roll rate to neutralize the Zero's traditional advantages in turning combat. The response was equally direct. Increase the altitude of initial interception to reduce the Corsair's speed advantage in the dive. Tighten formation spacing in the Loufberry circle to reduce tangential entry windows. And assign the most experienced pilots specifically to target and destroy any American fighter that broke formation to engage offensively before that pilot could disrupt the wider defensive structure. They did not know they were designing a tactical counter to a pilot who had 7 days left and had already been ordered to stop flying. But here is what made January 1944 different from everything that came before it. Hansen was not an anomaly. He was the leading edge of a generation. Across Marine fighter squadrons, 214, 221, and 223 pilots had been studying the same engagements, learning the same geometry, developing the same aggression toward defensive formations that doctrine had told them to avoid. The tactical shift was spreading faster than Japanese intelligence could track it. VMF-25 alone had produced 5 aces in the preceding 60 days. The Zero's dominance, which had been absolute in 1942, was dissolving not because American aircraft had suddenly become superior in every category, but because American pilots had stopped flying defensively and started hunting. The Japanese tactical review on February 1st was well-reasoned, professionally conducted, and completely correct in its analysis. It was also 3 months too late, February 3, 1944, 7:20 hours. 8 F4U Corsairs departed Piva North Airfield on Bougainville, escorting 18 TBF Avengers northeast toward Tabarra Airfield near Rabaul. The mission was straightforward: strike the runway, destroy parked aircraft, return. The route was familiar: northeast across Bougainville, straight north past New Ireland, final approach from the southeast at 9,000 feet. Hansen was not on the flight roster. He had stepped forward to replace a pilot incapacitated by food poisoning the previous night, and Major Owens, facing a mission that required 8 escorts for 18 bombers, had accepted the replacement without the time to formally deny it. Bureau number 56039 had been repaired overnight. Engine replaced. Aileron cable fixed. 47 bullet holes patched. At full throttle, it produced the same deep rolling thunder it had produced 4 days earlier over Simpson Harbor. Hansen pushed the throttle forward at 0720 and climbed into a clear morning sky. The strike on Tabarra went cleanly. The Avengers hit the runway at 0847. Secondary explosions indicated fuel storage hits. 15 Japanese fighters rose to intercept. The Corsair escort engaged them. 3 enemy aircraft were destroyed, no American losses. The formation turned southeast for home at 0903. Mission complete. All aircraft accounted for heading back across the Solomon Sea toward Bougainville. The return path carried them over Cape St. George at the southern tip of New Ireland. A white lighthouse with a black cap stood on the cape, visible from miles away. A prominent navigation landmark that also served as a Japanese observation post surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries and a radar installation that had been tracking Allied formations for months. As the formation passed over Kabanga Bay, Hansen broke off. He rolled and dove toward the lighthouse alone. The other pilots called out over the radio. Hansen did not respond. At 1,000 feet, he opened fire. 6.50 caliber Brownings raked the tower. Stone shattered. Windows exploded inward. Japanese anti-aircraft crews who had been tracking the departing formation swung their guns and answered instantly. 25mm and 40mm fire filled the sky around the Corsair in interlocking streams of tracers. Hansen pulled up from the strafing run. His right wing struck the water. The impact tore the wing from the fuselage at the root. The Corsair cartwheeled. For a moment, the remaining wing generated lift, and the aircraft climbed 50 feet 100. Then the separated wing's fuel ignited. A fireball engulfed the aircraft. The canopy shattered. The fuselage twisted. The Corsair snap-rolled inverted and struck the ocean at 140 miles per hour. The aircraft disintegrated on contact. Debris scattered across 200 yards of water. The fuselage sank immediately. No parachute appeared, no life raft deployed, no radio call was heard. Major Owens circled the crash site for 15 minutes. He saw floating wreckage and a widening oil slick. The VMF-25 War Diary entry for February 3rd was one sentence. Lieutenant Hansen did not return from this hop. Robert Murray Hansen was 23 years old. 1 day short of his 24th birthday. 7 days from his transport ship home. What the men of VMF-25 carried back from Cape St. George on February 3rd was not just the loss of a pilot. It was the specific weight of a death that did not have to happen. Hansen had been ordered home. His tour was complete. His record was extraordinary. 25 confirmed kills in 6 months, including 11 in the final 17 days of his life, including 9 in a single engagement on January 30th, that every man in the squadron had witnessed or been told about in detail by those who had. He had been 1 week from safety. He had chosen to keep flying. And on his final flight, having completed the assigned mission successfully, having turned for home with every other pilot in the formation, he had broken away alone to attack a lighthouse. The men who had flown beside him spent years afterward trying to explain it. Some said he was incapable of letting a target pass. Some said he saw the observation post as a legitimate threat to future missions and acted on that tactical judgment. Some said he was 23 years old and had been killing Japanese aircraft for 6 months and did not yet fully believe it could end. None of these explanations were wrong. None of them were complete. What the record shows is this. In the 4 months between October 1943 and February 1944, Marine fighter squadrons operating over Rabaul fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of the air war over the Southwest Pacific. The combination of the Corsair's performance envelope and the aggressive engagement doctrine that pilots like Hansen were developing through combat experience, not through doctrine manuals, had reduced Japanese interception effectiveness by 40% and bomber loss rates by more than half. The Zero was still dangerous. The pilots flying it were still skilled, but the tactical initiative had shifted, and it had shifted because a generation of Marine pilots had decided that the right response to an overwhelming defensive formation was not to avoid it, but to attack directly, accept the short-term risk, and use superior speed and firepower to destroy the formation's internal coherence before it could coordinate. Hansen had done this 25 times. He had been shot down once, ditched in the ocean, spent 6 hours in a raft, transferred to a new squadron, and returned to combat. He had been separated from his formation and attacked 5, then 4, then 9 enemy aircraft alone and destroyed them. He had been ordered to stop flying and found a mission slot anyway. He was not reckless. He was precise, calculating, cold in the cockpit, mathematical in his selection of targets and angles and firing windows. The 9 aircraft he destroyed on January 30th were not destroyed by luck or aggression alone. They were destroyed by a pilot who understood the geometry of aerial combat more completely than almost anyone alive in the Pacific in early 1944. On February 10th, the transport ship he had been scheduled to board departed Bougainville for Pearl Harbor without him. In Washington, the Medal of Honor citation described his actions in language that was formal and precise and entirely inadequate. Lone and gallant battle, striking with devastating fury, indifference to great personal danger. The citations always used words like these, words that were accurate and said almost nothing about what actually happened. What actually happened was a 23-year-old man from Indiana rolled inverted at 12,000 feet, dove into 21 enemy fighters, and systematically destroyed their formation while absorbing 47 bullet holes in an aircraft with a failing engine and a damaged aileron, because the 18 torpedo bombers below him needed someone to draw the attack away, and he was the only one who moved. He was promoted to captain posthumously. He received the Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, and the Air Medal. His name was inscribed on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines because no body was ever recovered from Kabanga Bay. In 1945, the destroyer, USS Hansen, was commissioned in his honor. In 1968, the Marine Corps Aviation Association created the Robert M. Hansen Award, given annually to the finest Marine fighter attack squadron in the Corps. It continues to be awarded to this day, which means that every year, somewhere in the Marine Corps, the best fighter pilots in the branch compete for a trophy named after a man who died at 23, 7 days before he was supposed to go home because he could not fly past a target without attacking it. The full story of what happened over Rabaul on January 30th, 1944 was never entirely verified. Gun cameras confirmed 3 kills. Witness statements added 1 more. 5 others were downgraded to probables. On paper, the number was 4. In the sky, it was 9. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between what aerial combat produces and what paperwork can capture. The men who were there knew what they saw. The men in the formation below in 18 TBF Avengers, heading for Simpson Harbor that morning, knew that one Corsair had broken away and drawn 21 fighters after it, and that they had reached their target and dropped their bombs and turned for home without losing a single aircraft. They knew what that meant, even if the paperwork said 4. There is one more chapter to this story. The chapter about what a single pilot's example did to the doctrine, the tactics, and the culture of Marine Corps aviation in the months that followed February 3, 1944. The chapter about the pilots who studied what Hansen had done and applied it in engagements across the remaining 16 months of the Pacific War. The chapter about what it costs to be the man who demonstrates something is possible before anyone has written the rule that says you are allowed to do it. That chapter is the one most histories skip, and it is the one that explains why 80 years later, the best Marine fighter pilots in the world still compete every year to carry his name. Robert Murray Hansen flew 26 combat missions over the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. He shot down 25 confirmed enemy aircraft in 6 months, including 9 in a single 40-minute engagement against 21 fighters. He was ordered home on February 10, 1944. He died on February 3, 7 days before that ship departed, 1 day before his 24th birthday, when his Corsair struck the water off Cape St. George after a strafing run nobody ordered him to make. The question that every subsequent history of VMF-25 eventually reaches is the same question. Not how he died, how he lived, and what the living meant for every pilot who came after him. He never saw the Medal of Honor ceremony. The citation was read into the congressional record on February 21, 1944, 18 days after his death. His parents, Norwegian Methodist missionaries living in Lucknow, India, received the notification by telegram. They had raised their son in a country that was not their own, in a culture defined by discipline and service and quiet conviction, and they had watched him become a wrestling champion and an engineering student, and then a Marine pilot who flew to the other side of the world and attacked 21 Japanese fighters alone, because 18 torpedo bombers needed someone to draw the pursuit away. The telegram reached them 12,000 miles from the Coral Runway, where Bureau number 56039 had rolled to a stop with 47 bullet holes 11 days before his death. There was no body to receive. There was no grave to visit. There was only a name inscribed on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines, carved in stone, alongside the names of more than 36,000 other Americans whose remains were never recovered from the Pacific. The destroyer, USS Hansen, commissioned in 1945, served the United States Navy for 22 years. It participated in the Korean War and conducted patrols during the early years of the Cold War before being decommissioned in 1967. The men who served aboard it were not all historians. Many of them knew only the outline of the story attached to the name on the hull. But the name was there every day, on every watch, in every sea state, which is its own kind of memory. The Robert M. Hansen Award, established by the Marine Corps Aviation Association in 1968, has been presented every year since to the finest Marine fighter attack squadron in the Corps. It has been awarded for 67 consecutive years. The pilots who compete for it today fly F/A-18 Hornets and F-35B, Lightning II's aircraft that would be unrecognizable to a man who learned to fly in 1942. The principles those pilots use to gain positional advantage, to control geometry, to prioritize energy, overturning engagements to break defensive formations through aggressive tangential entry, rather than direct confrontation, those principles would not be unrecognizable at all. The tactical doctrine that Hansen was developing through combat experience in late 1943 and early 1944 was not formalized in any manual during his lifetime. It existed in debriefs and squadron conversations in the gun camera footage that intelligence officers studied after each mission. After his death, the Marine Corps compiled the engagement records of VMF-25 and VMF-214 for the period October 1943 through February 1944, and used them as the basis for updated fighter escort doctrine that was distributed across Pacific Aviation Commands in the spring of 1944. The updated doctrine explicitly codified what Hansen and pilots like him had been doing instinctively, that a single aggressive fighter breaking formation to engage and scatter an intercepting enemy formation was tactically preferable to maintaining tight escort if the engagement geometry was favorable, because a scattered formation of individual fighters posed significantly less threat to slow bombers than a coordinated intercept. The doctrine had a name in the distribution memo. It was called offensive escort. The pilots who received it recognized it immediately as a description of what Butcher Bob had been doing since January 14th. The influence did not stop in 1945. The Korean War beginning in 1950 placed American jet pilots against Soviet-built MiG-15S in engagements over the Yalu River that produced a body of tactical knowledge now called MiG-Alley Doctrine. The core principle used superior speed and roll rate to control engagement geometry, rather than accepting turning combat on the enemy's terms, was a direct continuation of what propeller-era pilots had learned over Rabaul. The kill ratio achieved by American F-86 Sabre pilots against MiG-15S, approximately 10-1 across the conflict, owed something measurable to the institutional memory embedded in American fighter aviation between 1943 and 1945. Vietnam produced the same pattern, degraded initially by a generation of pilots trained primarily for nuclear delivery, rather than dogfighting, then corrected through the establishment of the Navy Fighter Weapons School in 1969. A program built explicitly on the lesson that tactical skills deteriorate without deliberate practice, and that no technological advantage survives contact with a skilled enemy unless the pilot behind the technology understands geometry, energy, and the moment to commit. The lesson Hansen's career teaches is not primarily about courage, though courage is present in every engagement of his 6-month record. It is about the relationship between doctrine and reality, and about what happens when a man with genuine tactical intelligence encounters a situation that doctrine has not yet caught up to. The Japanese Lufberry Circle was a tactically sound formation that American doctrine had no established counter to in late 1943. The established response was to avoid it. Hansen looked at the circle, identified the geometric window created by a tangential entry aligned with the formation's rotation, and attacked it. He did this without authorization, without precedent, and without any institutional support for the approach. He did it because it was the correct answer to the tactical problem in front of him, and he was capable of deriving correct answers under conditions that would have paralyzed most people. This pattern appears repeatedly in the history of warfare. Billy Mitchell argued for independent air power in 1921 and was court-martialed for insubordination in 1925. He was posthumously restored to the rank of Major General by Congress in 1946, after the air war in Europe and the Pacific had validated every central claim of his argument. John Boyd, the Air Force pilot, whose energy maneuverability theory transformed fighter aircraft design in the 1960s, and whose OODA loop decision cycle became foundational to military strategy across all branches, spent most of his career fighting institutional resistance from officers who found his ideas threatening to existing procurement programs and doctrinal frameworks. The pattern is consistent. The institution preserves what worked last time. The individual who understands the new problem clearly enough to derive a new solution is almost by definition operating outside the institution's framework. The institution's first response is almost always resistance. The second response after the solution has been demonstrated to work under combat conditions is adoption without attribution. Hansen was 23 years old. He had been in combat for 8 months. He had no formal tactical theory, no published doctrine, no institutional backing. He had a Corsair 6 Browning machine guns and an understanding of 3-dimensional geometry that he had developed engagement by engagement across 26 missions. He was not trying to change doctrine. He was trying to get the bombers home. The doctrine change was a consequence, not a goal. Now here is the detail that most accounts of Hansen's story omit entirely, the detail that closes the loop in a way that no medal citation or destroyer commissioning ceremony quite manages. In December 1943, 6 weeks before Hansen's extraordinary run of 11 kills in 17 days, Marine Corps Headquarters in Washington received a formal request from the commander of Marine Air Group 12 to review and potentially update fighter escort doctrine for the Rabaul campaign. The request cited mounting bomber losses and the inadequacy of tight formation escort against the volume and coordination of Japanese fighter response. The request was reviewed, assigned to a committee, and tabled pending further operational data. The committee was still deliberating when Hansen landed with 47 bullet holes on January 30th. The gun camera footage and the witness statements from that engagement were forwarded to Washington as part of the operational data the committee had requested. 3 months later, the updated offensive escort doctrine was distributed to Pacific commands. The committee cited, among other sources, the engagement records of First Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen FIV MF-25 as primary evidence supporting the doctrinal revision. The institution that had not yet updated its doctrine when Hansen was flying had in the end updated its doctrine because Hansen had flown. The formal request for review and the combat evidence that answered it arrived in Washington from opposite ends of the chain of command and met in a committee room that never knew the name of the pilot who provided the evidence. The doctrine that emerged from that meeting shaped American fighter aviation for the next generation. And the pilot who provided the evidence was already 11 weeks dead. Robert Murray Hansen flew his first combat mission in August 1943 and his last on February 3, 1944. In that 6-month span, he compiled a record that has never been exceeded by a Marine Corps pilot in a comparable period: 25 confirmed kills, multiple solo engagements against formations of 10 or more aircraft, a Medal of Honor, a Navy Cross, and a tactical legacy that outlasted the war, outlasted the aircraft he flew, and outlasted every institutional framework that tried to contain what he understood intuitively about the geometry of aerial combat. He was the son of missionaries. He was a wrestling champion. He was a 23-year-old from Indiana who volunteered to replace a sick pilot on a mission he was not supposed to fly, completed that mission, successfully broke formation on the way home to attack a lighthouse because it was there and it was a legitimate target, and died in Kabanga Bay 1 day before his 24th birthday. 7 days from home. 1 day from 24. 25 kills. 1 Corsair. 21 fighters. 40 minutes. 47 bullet holes. There is a version of this story in which Hansen boards the transport ship on February 10th, sails to Pearl Harbor, returns to the United States, and lives a long life with a Medal of Honor on his wall, and stories he probably would never have told. There is a version in which he survives the lighthouse and makes it back to Piva North and packs his gear and goes home to Indiana and becomes a flight instructor or an engineer or a man who raises children who do not know what their father did over Rabaul. Those versions did not happen. What happened is the version in which he decided one last time that a target within range was a target worth attacking, and made the only decision he ever seemed to make when a target was within range. If you have spent time with this story, you already understand why it matters. It matters because the history of every war contains men like Hansen. Men who understood the problem clearly enough to solve it before the institution had written the rule that permitted the solution, and whose names we almost never learn, because they died before the solution was attributed, before the doctrine was updated, before the committee finished deliberating. It matters because the bombers got home on January 30th, 1944, and the men aboard them had families they returned to, and those families exist today without knowing the name of the pilot who rolled inverted at 12,000 feet and dove into 21 fighters so that 18 torpedo bombers could complete their run and turn for home. And it matters because somewhere in the Marine Corps right now, the pilot's competing for the Robert M. Hansen Award are studying geometry energy, and the moment to commit practicing the principles that a 23-year-old from Indiana derived through combat and paid for with his life, not knowing that the man whose name is on the trophy had 7 days left when he made the decision that sealed it. That is the cost of being first, and that is why we remember.